Okay, we are on page 21b, and if you're following along in the art scroll, that's in 21b1. Okay, previously on Taanit, we've discovered this idea that there are many different things that result in a Taanit. So the chief concept that we've discussed is regarding a lack of rain. So when there's not enough rain, so there's a teshuvah process, and part of the teshuvah process, as we've discussed already earlier, is when people take it seriously, And in order to have prayers and teshuvah that happen seriously, so one of the things that we've created, one of the mechanisms we have is the process of taking a ta'anit where a person is fasting. We've already discussed that there's different types of ta'anit, how strict we are with the ta'anit. When does it begin? Does it begin the night before? Does it begin in the morning? How many prayers are you going to utter? Do you shut the stores? Do they take the bima out into the street in order to pray in the street? So we indicate, that there's a level of mourning involved. Do they wear sackcloth and ashes? So the Mishnah talked about how far we go in setting the stage so that a person is fasting. And as the Mishnah Birura commented, like we said last time, the idea of a ta'anit is not really primarily about the fact that you're eating or not eating. God doesn't care so much about it. We're primarily fasting for ourselves to be able to take the process of prayer and teshuvah in a much more serious level. Okay, so the Gemara now discusses what happens. The Mishnah brought up this idea that ta'anit also happens when there are other elements of danger that accompany, that come to a person. So one element of danger might be when a person is in an experience of a famine, even if there's not a lack of rain, or if there's some sort of sickness. And the Gemara went through an idea of what does it mean that there's a plague? If 2 people die, is that a plague? If 3 people die, is that a plague? How many people have to die that in order to be able to call something a plague? What's the proximity of those people? What's the distance in time between those deaths? In order to say that that's not just another person dying, but rather this is a procedure of or a plague that's kind of sweeping through the city. So now the Gemara is going to discuss specifically a scenario where a fast was instituted because of a people dying in a certain amount of time. So the Gemara talked about how there's a city that has 500 ragli, 500 people. But specifically, what kind of people? As we discussed earlier, we said that when we talk about 500 people, we're talking about a city that has 500 people in its armed guards. So that's not a measurement of the city, but it's a measurement of how big the city is by proxy, by saying a city that has 500 people in its army, that's how big the city is going to be. So, Drokat ir hamotzi'ah 500 ragli hava. Okay? V'yatzeu mimena 3 metim b'yom echad. 3 people died in one day. Gazar Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda ta'anita. So he instituted on that time when 3 people passed away, we had a ratio of 3 people dying to a 500 person city. That's a ratio of numbers. And the numbers were fulfilled. So Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda, he instituted a fast. And that was actually in opposition to the Braita that we said earlier. So if you turn back a couple of lines, if you look back at what we said before, the Mishnah, the Braita said, okay, that if you have, let's go back just one second. When do you have dever? When you have 500 people in such a situation. Tanu Rabbanan, Ira motzi'ah 500 ve'elef ragli, kmo kfar Akko, 1,500, v'yatzu emena 9 metim b'shosha yamim, ze achar ze, 9 people die in 3 days, one after the next. That's considered dever. Is a dever. B'yom echad, if they die in 1 day, or b'daled yamim, or in 4 days, en ze dever. That's not considered dever. V'ira motzi'ah 500. What if there's 500 people in that city? Kegon kfar amiku, like such a city. V'yatzu min 3 metim gimel yamim ze achar ze. When they die 3 days, one after the next. Okay, harei ze dever. That's considered dever. But b'yom echad, but if it happens in 1 day, or be'arba'a yamim, or in 4 days, that's not considered dever. That's not considered a pestilence, or it's not considered. So here you have a Braita or a Mishnah that says that if all 3 people die in 1 day, that's not a dever, that's not a progressive plague spreading through the city. That's a bad day. Okay? All right. So Rav Nachman, the son of Rav Chizda, he instituted a Taanit in opposition to the Braita that we just learned, that 3 people in one day he considered a pestilence. He considered a dever. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, Keman, who are you going according to? Ki Rabbi Meir, de Amar, you going according to Rabbi Meir. De Amar, the Rabbi Meir says, what is he talking about? Richek negichotav hayav. Kirev negichotav lo kol sheken. Now, the Gemara is wont to do this. We bring proofs from things that seem to have no correlation to what we're talking about whatsoever. What's the example that we're bringing over here? Rabbi Meir says, in a scenario of a ox that gores. So let's go through the broad baseline of what we're talking about here. The Gemara in Baba Kama says that if you have an ox and it gores one time, how much do you pay? Chatzi nezek, half. You pay half of the damages. You know why? Because in order for me to say that I have an obligation to have worried or to have paid attention to my ox, if my ox goes and eats your cabbage, I got to know that my animal is going to eat, because that's what animals do. If my animal walks by, damages it by knocking it over, I know my animal walks, that's a normal thing for me to expect, okay? So I should have expected it, I have to pay for it. If my ox gores, takes its horns, or if my ox walks up and he kicks something like, to do damage, that's not the nature of such an animal. So I'm kind of half expected to be worried about that. So the Gemara says that if an ox does an act of nigicha, of goring, or something similar to that, I have to pay half price, because there's no way I should have known. We have a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that says a shore tam, a shore that's not yet established to have done this behavior, I pay half the price. That's nezek.
It's not he damaged my cabbage, or he gored my something. Why wouldn't he not pay a full amount?
What do you mean?
Why, if it's Stanley's
ox gores your object.
Right.
So Stanley has to pay you half price. Right. Why? Because he's only really kind of half liable. All right? So that's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that chatzi nezek, a person pays, pasuk in Torah, tam pays half price. How long? 3 times. Once it does it 3 times, it becomes a shor mu'ad. A shor which is already, you're expected. You have to think that this is coming, because you've seen it happen this many times. Okay? Now that's the halacha, okay? After 3 times, then what's it called? Then I know that this animal is going to do it, and it's already a shor mu'ad. So Rabbi Meir says, when it comes to that scenario, if an animal does richek negichotav, let's say it's spaced out the gorings over a few days. So then the halacha is that an animal has to pay. You have to pay for it. What happens? Kirev negichotav. If the animal, instead of doing it gores on Sunday, on Monday, and on Tuesday, it gores 3 times on the same day. Rabbi Meir holds, how much more so are you obligated, right? Because the animal is telling you that, look at how it did it in 2 seconds. This is its pattern of behavior. So if Rabbi Meir is saying in the laws of goring that 3 times over 3 days is the halacha, but 3 times in 1 day is a kol sheken for sure, so too if the Mishnah tells us that in 3 people die over 3 days, it's a dever, then how much more so 3 people die in 1 day, it's going to be a dever. So the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Chizda, is going according to that opinion of Rabbi Meir, that we would say that it's a kol sheken. It's a how much more so? Okay, now the Gemara is going to go on a sidebar. Amalei Rav Nachman. So now he's going according to Rabbi Meir, he could argue on a braita. We said in our original story, we talked about the idea that Amorah, someone who was born in the period of time of the Amoraim, he can't argue on anyone that comes from the Tanaim. So an Amorah can't argue on a Mishnah. He also can't argue on a Braita, because the Braita is also from the time of the Tanaim. So he can't argue on the generation that came before him. But we found an opinion of Rabbi Meir that he could rely on, and now he's able to follow that opinion, and therefore he's safe. Now the Gemara says, this Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, who protects the opinion of Rabbi Nachman bar Chizda, let's learn a little bit about how he related to that rabbi. Amar le Rav Nachman bar Chizda, le Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Chizda said to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Lekumar, leti legaban, let us rise, let's stand up. Leti legaban, come live with us, in where we are. I live in a more Torah, more, impressive city than you live in. Come join us, live in our town. Amale, he said to him, Tanina, we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Yosei Omer, lo mikomo shel adam mechabdo, the place that a person lives in, that's not what brings him honor. Ela adam mechaber et mikomo. You, if you are a person of integrity, of Torah, you infuse the place with your honor. Okay? So if I come to your town and everybody there is already holding on a much higher level, so I'm not going to bring honor, I'm not going to get honor or bring honor to the place